The winter wind cut across the open plains like an unseen blade, carrying with it the sting of ice and the muffled roar of a storm brewing far to the north. Snow stretched endlessly in all directions, interrupted only by the jagged lines of a barbed wire fence and the skeletal forms of bare cottonwood trees. The land felt empty, save for a single rider making his slow way along the fence line. Elias Carter had long since grown accustomed to the loneliness of these winters. At 48, with 15 years of ranching behind him and 5 years of widowhood shadowing every season since, his life had settled into a rhythm of work, silence, and the faint memory of laughter that once filled his modest farmhouse. The world beyond his ranch boundaries might have been bustling with voices, roads, and neon light. But out here, it was only the crunch of snow under his horse's hooves and the steady creak of saddle leather that reminded him time was moving forward at all. The sky was heavy with low, gray clouds, the kind that pressed down on the land as though daring anything fragile to survive beneath them. Elias tugged his scarf tighter against the cold and turned his horse toward the south pasture. He had planned only to check the fencing before nightfall, then return to the fire and the book waiting on his kitchen table. But halfway along the fence line, something caught his attention, a disturbance in the uniform white of the snow. At first, he thought it was just wind-blown debris caught against the posts. Then he saw movement. Small, frantic, barely visible against the sweep of snow. A shape began to form the closer he came. A dark-haired woman slumped against a weathered fence post, her back bound to it by coarse rope. Her head hung forward, her hair tangled and dusted with frost. Around her, scattered like fragile fallen leaves, were tiny bundles wrapped in thin, torn cloth. Elias dismounted without thinking, the crunch of his boots breaking the thick silence. The sight hit him with the cold shock of water. 5 newborns, their small faces flushed from crying, their breath clouding faintly in the frigid air. Their mother, if she could even be called that in her current state, sat motionless except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. The thin dress she wore clung to her in the wind, the fabric stiff where it had frozen. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale and bruised in angry shades of purple and blue. The babies squirmed weakly, their cries already fading into the strained whimpers of exhaustion. Elias knew enough about the cold to understand how close they all were to losing the fight. Kneeling in the snow, he saw the rope was cutting into her wrists, raw and bloodied from struggling. Whoever had left her here had meant for the snow to finish what their cruelty had started. The line of the fence stretched in both directions, disappearing into a haze of falling flakes. There was no sign of anyone else. No tracks fresh enough to follow. The woman's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his movement. They were dark, wide, and filled with the kind of fear that made even the smallest motion hesitant. She tried to shift, instinctively curling herself toward the babies as if to shield them from him. Elias stayed still, letting the cold burn into his knees as he took in the scene. The rope was knotted inexpertly but tight enough to hold. Her ankles were free, though half buried in snow, her bare feet mottled red and white from the freezing ground. Every instinct in him screamed to get them all out of the wind, but her breathing was shallow and erratic. The babies, he wasn't sure they had more than an hour in this cold. The wind rose, dragging loose strands of her hair into her face. A heavy gust sent dry snow curling across the ground, covering the edges of the bundles the infants lay in. Inside, the air was blessedly warm from the fire he'd banked that morning. He carried the babies to the hearth first, setting them in a nest of blankets pulled from the chest by the wall. The woman he placed on the settee, close enough to the heat that the frost on her hair began to melt instantly. The sound of the wind outside faded behind the thick walls, replaced by the crackle of flames and the soft, uneven breathing of his unexpected guests. Elias moved with practiced urgency, adding wood to the fire, filling a pot with water from the pump, pulling down jars of broth and the small tin of milk he kept for emergencies. The babies, now freed from their stiff cloth wraps, were impossibly small. Their fingers curled and uncurled weakly in the air. He draped warmed blankets over them, tucking each one in gently. A faint cry came from one, a sound that, in that moment, was more reassuring than silence. The woman's eyes were open again, watching him with a mixture of wariness and disbelief. Her lips moved once, as if to speak, but no sound came. Elias only nodded, setting a cup of steaming broth within her reach and moving to check the children once more. Outside, the storm closed over the land, burying the fence line and the tracks they'd left behind. Whatever had driven her to that frozen stretch of pasture, whatever cruelty had tied her there, was lost, for now, to the white expanse. Inside the small ranch house, the firelight cast long shadows on the walls, wrapping the room in a fragile cocoon of warmth. Elias knew the night would be long. The questions, who she was, where she had come from, and why she had been left to die, would wait. For now, there was only the slow work of keeping 5 tiny lives, and one barely holding on, from slipping away into the snow. The wind battered the windows, but within, the rhythm of breathing, hers and the baby's, began to steady. In the quiet, Elias felt something he hadn't in years. The weight of responsibility for another's life, and the strange, unspoken bond it forged. He didn't know it yet, but nothing about his life on this isolated ranch would remain the same after this night. The wind outside clawed at the shutters, a restless reminder of the world beyond the warm glow of the fire. Elias sat forward in the worn armchair, elbows braced on his knees, eyes moving from the woman to the small row of bundled shapes on the hearth rug. Every so often, one of the babies would twitch or let out a small sigh, and he'd feel a quiet pulse of relief. The woman hadn't moved much since he'd placed her on the settee. The heat from the fire had put a faint flush back into her cheeks, but the bruises stood out in harsh contrast against her skin. Her hair, now thawing, clung damply to her face and neck. The rope burns at her wrists had darkened, and he could see the marks where fibers had bitten deep into the flesh. Elias leaned back and let his eyes drift to the window. Snow whirled past in dense sheets, making it impossible to see more than a few feet into the night. Out there, the fence line was disappearing under drifts. Out there, someone had walked away after leaving her tied in the cold. That thought sat like a stone in his chest. A soft sound pulled him back. One of the babies, the smallest, shifted beneath the blanket, its cry thin but insistent. Elias knelt, lifting the child carefully, feeling the fragile heat against his palms. He fetched the small bottle of warmed milk from the hearth and coaxed the baby to drink. The moment the milk touched its lips, it lashed weakly, swallowing in slow, uneven pulls. He didn't realize she was watching until he glanced up. Her gaze was fixed on him, no longer wary, but something else, uncertain, searching. For a moment, their eyes held, and in that silent exchange, the room seemed smaller, the wind quieter. She blinked first, lowering her gaze to her lap. The fire popped sharply, sending a cascade of sparks upward. Elias laid the baby back among its siblings and rose to stoke the flames. Shadows shifted along the log walls, and the smell of the broth deepened in the room. He ladled some into a smaller cup and brought it to her again, setting it in her hands without a word. Her fingers were cold against the warm ceramic. She tried to drink, but her grip faltered, and he steadied the cup until she'd taken enough to swallow. A faint tremor ran through her, and for a brief moment, she seemed ready to speak. But instead, she leaned back against the cushions, her eyes closing. Elias didn't press her. Whatever she had endured had drained her to the edge of collapse. The questions could wait until she had the strength to answer them. For now, the only truth that mattered was that she was here, alive, and so were the 5 children sleeping at the edge of the firelight. He settled back into the chair, letting the warmth seep into his bones. The rhythm of the fire, the occasional sigh of the wind against the roof, and the soft breathing of the babies filled the hours. From time to time, he would rise, check the blankets, adjust the fire, or change the damp cloths around the babies to keep them dry and warm. The night wore on. The storm didn't break. Once, in the small hours, he thought he heard something, a faint crunch of snow under boots. But when he went to the door and opened it a crack, there was only the blinding white of the blizzard. No movement, no sound but the wind. Back inside, the woman stirred again. Her eyes opened briefly, focusing on the row of swaddled shapes near the fire. Her lips moved, barely audible, as if she were naming them in her mind. Elias stayed where he was, giving her space. He sensed that the moment she found her voice, the weight of her story would fall between them like a heavy stone. The babies shifted in their sleep, their tiny forms rising and falling in unison. Elias wondered at the sheer improbability of them being alive at all. The distance to the nearest town, the strength of the storm, the bitter cold, everything about this night had been an equation set against their survival. And yet, here they were. Outside, the wind's voice rose, a long, low moan over the frozen land. The fire burned steady, casting a soft, amber light over the room. In that glow, the woman's face softened, the tightness around her mouth easing for the first time. She seemed younger like this, though still etched with exhaustion. Elias shifted his gaze back to the flames, letting his thoughts wander to the morning. If the storm eased, there would be decisions to make about food, supplies, maybe even going into town for help. But there was also the matter of whoever had left her out there. People who did something like that rarely stopped once. The weight of responsibility pressed heavier on him than he'd felt in years. It wasn't just about keeping them alive through the night anymore. There was danger still moving somewhere beyond the white curtain of snow, and it had already found its way too close to his land. As the hours blurred toward dawn, Elias knew sleep wouldn't come for him tonight. Not until the storm broke. Not until the fire burned low and the shadows along the walls stopped looking like figures moving just out of reach. For now, all he could do was keep watch. By the time the first pale threads of morning pushed through the storm clouds, the wind had softened into a restless murmur. Snow lay deep against the fence posts outside, burying the world in silence. The storm had passed, but it had left the land looking as though it had been stripped of all color and sound. Elias stood at the window, the cold glass under his palm. From here, the drifts swallowed the lower rails of the corral, and the barn roof wore a heavy crown of snow. There were no tracks. His own from the night before had vanished, erased as if no one had ever crossed that field. Behind him, the fire was still alive, its glow washing over the small shapes curled in their blankets. The babies slept deeply now, their breathing steady. The woman was still on the settee, her hair spilling across the pillow, her wrists wrapped in clean linen strips Elias had torn from an old shirt. The bruises on her face had darkened overnight, shadowing her expression even in rest. Elias moved quietly, tending the fire and setting water to boil. When the scent of broth began to warm the air, she stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the light. For a moment, confusion flickered there. She looked to the hearth, to the babies, then to him. Her voice was rough, barely more than a whisper, but this time she spoke. The words came haltingly at first, as though each one had to be weighed before it left her mouth. Elias didn't interrupt. Piece by piece, the story took shape in the stillness of the room. She had been living in a small cabin on the far side of the county, isolated even more than his ranch. The man she lived with, her husband, though she spoke the word like it was ash in her mouth, had not wanted children. When the first baby came, he changed. By the second, his temper turned violent. The third had been the breaking point, and the fourth, the fifth, she hadn't even known she was carrying twins until the night they arrived. Elias kept his gaze steady, though each detail tightened something in his chest. She said he blamed her for the gender of their children, calling them curses instead of blessings. The night before the storm, he had bound her to the fence and left her there with the newborns, saying the cold would solve the problem. She had no idea how long she'd been there before the sound of hooves had cut through the wind. Her eyes glistened as she looked at the fire, not at him. There was no trace of self-pity in her voice, only exhaustion and the kind of disbelief that lingers when a person has survived something they can't quite believe happened at all. Elias listened until she fell silent. The only sound was the faint hiss of the pot over the fire. He didn't ask her what she wanted to do next. He doubted she had an answer yet. Instead, he ladled the broth into a cup and set it in her hands, making sure her fingers wrapped fully around the warmth. The babies began to stir as the light in the room grew stronger. Elias tended to them one by one, feeding and changing them with the quiet care of a man used to handling small, fragile things. The woman watched, her expression unreadable, though he caught her eyes following his movements more than once. Outside, the world remained still. No movement along the tree line, no sound but the occasional groan of snow sliding from the roof. But Elias knew better than to think the danger was gone. Men who could walk away from their own blood in the cold didn't give up their malice at sunrise. When the woman finished the broth, Her shoulders eased slightly. She leaned back against the cushions, a faint color in her cheeks now. For the first time, her gaze lingered on the walls of the cabin, the shelves lined with worn books, the rifle above the mantel, the framed photograph of a smiling woman beside a younger version of Elias. The questions in her eyes were plain, but she didn't ask them. He didn't offer answers. There would be time for that later. By mid-morning, the snow outside had begun to drift in gentle veils from the trees. The sun, pale and cold, cut a thin light over the land. Elias stepped out to check the barn, the door groaning against the packed snow. His breath curled in the air as he looked over the fields, still no sign of tracks. But the quiet felt too deep, too deliberate, like the pause before something moved. Back inside, he found her sitting up, one of the babies cradled in her arms. She didn't look at him as he entered, but her grip on the child was fierce, protective. The air between them felt charged now, not with fear, but with something unspoken, an understanding that whatever happened next, their paths were bound together by more than chance. The snow might have buried the tracks, but the past had a way of finding its way back, and neither of them could pretend the storm had erased it. And somewhere beyond the fence line, a man still walked free. The first sign came at dusk, a dark speck against the pale horizon, moving steadily along the fence line. Elias saw it from the porch, the long shadow stretching over the snow. The woman was inside, the babies bundled close to the fire, unaware of the figure closing the distance. He stepped down into the snow, his boots sinking deep, the cold biting through the wool. The man's gait was heavy, purposeful, his coat flapping in the wind. When he was close enough, Elias saw the eyes, flat, assessing, the kind that weighed people the way others weighed cattle. No words passed between them at first. The man's gaze flicked toward the house, lingering as though he could see through the walls. Elias shifted his stance, placing himself firmly in the path. When the man finally spoke, his voice was casual, almost bored, but laced with something colder than the wind. He said he'd come for what was his. Elias didn't move. The silence that followed was sharp, stretched taut between them. Elias could feel the weight of it, the way the man expected him to yield, to step aside like every other obstacle in his life. But the snow under Elias's boots might as well have been stone. He told the man there was nothing for him here. His voice was steady, final, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. Something in the man's eyes shifted, recognition, maybe, that this was not a fence he could push through. He hesitated, then spat into the snow, turning without another word. His figure grew smaller against the horizon until the storm swallowed him whole. Inside, the woman looked up as Elias entered, the tension in her shoulders easing only when she saw his face. He closed the door behind him, the wind's howl muffled to a low hum. The babies slept on, their breaths soft and even. The woman's eyes glistened, and for the first time, there was no fear in them, only a quiet, fragile trust.